So I'm very pleased to welcome Philippe Garner here.
I'm very pleased to be here.
To the Martin Parr Foundation. I would say he's been more responsible for the whole business of photography auctions in the world, not just in this country, than anyone else I know. So I'm here to really find out a bit more about how this all started.
Well, I believe I'm kind of the last man standing from a certain generation, right. Aren't I?
Yeah. So I believe the first photography auction in the world was 1971 in Sotheby's. Can you just tell us how this came about?
Indeed. Well, it would be a false claim to say it was the first photography auction in the world ever. But what it was the first photography auction of the modern market. It was the first auction of photographs which was staged with the intention of it being initiating an ongoing program. There had been one-off events previously, estate sales or whatever, but it really marked the beginning of the modern market. That's the claim I would make for it. It was on December 21st, 1971 at Sotheby's, 50 years ago.
Amazing, isn't it?
Hard to believe. And it came about really because it was one element in an evolving marketplace where at last the 19th century was starting to be reappraised in the broadest sense. Sotheby's saw the potential in 19th century works of all kinds, which had been largely neglected in the marketplace, and planned and launched a new sale room, Sotheby's Belgravia in Mottcombe Street, Belgravia, to be devoted to the 19th century. Photography was chosen as a subject that would be a part of that mix, the celebration really of one of the great inventions of the 19th century. And I, in the end, was volunteered to be put to be in charge of cataloguing and coordinating that sale.
And do I assume that you had an interest in photography previous to that? Obviously, the 60s was a big explosion of photography in the UK.
I did, and I guess in various ways. I mean, I'm of that generation that saw blow up in 1967, that bought into the mythology around the photographer as part of the phenomenon of a new culture of the 60s. But photography meant more to me than that, and I would say, when did my engagement with photographs begin? Certainly in the early 60s, before London started to swing. But when visual imagery, a certain kind of visual imagery, photographic imagery, became ever more widely available. I'm thinking of the colour supplements. I'm thinking of a generation of magazines which really provided extraordinary inspiration to my young, impressionable, visually curious mind. And the Sunday Times launched in February '62. I became a teenager in March '62. So I think that there is a kind of connection between this curiosity, this growing curiosity of the young Philippe Garner, and the opportunity to learn, to absorb through the printed media.
But that first auction really looked at 19th century photography.
Yes, that first auction was exclusively 19th century, built really around Fox Talbot, Julia Margaret Cameron, Helen Adamson, the great heroic figures of
And how would you go about actually doing estimates for work that had no history of being sold?
Fortunately, in those days, we didn't publish estimates. It's hard to believe today.
Interesting.
But the auction world was a very different place. Today we use that rather fancy word of curating sales. We piece them together in the mirror of what we have planned. I would say at that date the auction houses were much more, how to describe it, they were like a conveyor belt of materials that people wanted to sell. there was a phenomenal flow of material, and we shaped it as best we could.
So
and
you had,
to some extent, led taste. But most people who consigned were ready to let the market decide what things were worth. And yes, of course, we had to have some idea of expectations in case people asked. But curiously, the estimates were kept close to our chest.
And what made the top spot on that first auction?
I can tell you, it was a copy of The Pencil of Nature, William Henry Fox Talbot's landmark. Well, it was a sequential publication, but it was the bound volume of the various parts.
And I hate to ask how much.
£2,200, if I remember rightly, which was a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's when we look back at prices today, you think, oh God, if only. Mm-hmm. But what you forget was my monthly. Well, I'm trying to remember what my income was at that point. When I started at Sotheby's, on the training scheme in '70, I was paid £700 and something a year. So 2,200 was a not inconsequential sum.
And was it difficult to recruit lots for these auctions?
That sale came together somehow by calling on other colleagues. You know, the book department would occasionally handle photographs. That was the natural venue for them. I remember a colleague, Mike Heseltine, in the book department, Howard Ricketts, the director who had been instrumental in proposing and championing the idea, was already himself a collector of photographs and had started to build a little network of contacts. So material came through those contacts, and from various trade sources. Mm-hmm.
And when did the invasion of the American dealers, who really saw great bargains to be had in London, really start? Were they there for the first auction, or did it take them a while?
There was American interest in the first auction, but it took a year, or not much more than a year, for the word to be out that there was treasures to be had in London, and that made all the difference. Right. It was the arrival of the Americans. There was a growing group who came to London every time there was a photograph.
So we're talking Sam Wagstaff, Henry Lunn.
Well, Harry Lunn was a key first player because he was a great encourager of others. Sam Wagstaff turned up for the first time in the autumn of '73, and Sam and then Robert Mapplethorpe were rapidly followed by other really very sophisticated collectors. So we had the market really depended on
American
dealers and collectors. Yeah,
because this goes back to the fact that in America, the status of photography was so much higher than here in the UK. Back in the 60s and 50s, for example.
Well, back in the 50s and 60s here, it had no status at all, really, whereas it was already building its position in the museum world. It had real credibility in the States. I mean, some people might scratch one's head and ask why, and I think, a simplistic, but perhaps to some extent true explanation is the length of the American history as it was being written and promoted was relatively short, and a significant proportion of American history had been documented by the camera. Mm-hmm. I think that there was an appetite for the new and the modern in America, which was very different from the fundamental conservatism of European and certainly British.
And do you think that that whole attitude towards photography is still relevant today? In other words, do you feel that in Britain we still don't appreciate photography to the extent that they have done in even Europe, France, Germany, and the States?
I think that has changed. I think it has. I think there's a much greater popular interest in photography in this country, but I'm not sure that it's matched by the same depth of collecting interest. I think the reality is there's been a very sustained and regular program of first-rate photographic exhibitions and activity in this country in recent decades. But we don't have the depth of collecting of serious scholarship that we see in America.
Yeah. So going back, I believe the first time you actually sold some contemporary work was in 1975 when you collaborated with a photographer's gallery to do a fundraising exhibition.
Yes. The sales started in 71, very much focused on the 19th century, and the 19th century dominated for many years. Gradually, earlier 20th century works might be brought into the programme. They were. But a key event was the March 75 benefit auction for the Photographer's Gallery, which was exclusively contemporary. And the Photographer's Gallery needed funds. They were surviving on a wing and a prayer. Sue Davis, the then director, had the idea of an auction. We discussed it. I got clearance for it to happen at Sotheby's Belgravia and became very much involved with Sue in making that sale a success. And it contained works requested from a very wide range of contemporary, of active photographers. And I would say in most cases, if not all cases, for those photographers, it was the very first time their work had been tested in the auction marketplace. So in that sense, I would say it really was a landmark event. It was a great success. We had timed it to coincide with a regular auction, which meant that the American and other foreign contingent were there. The room was packed. There was every lot sold, and it was a good day for photography.
I bet the prices also would be
remarkable
when we look back.
With hindsight,
always very useful, isn't it?
Yes. The top lot was a work by Irving Penn, which sold for £260, which was a very significant price to pay at the time. People were happy with the results.
Amazing. Yeah. And had Sue asked not only British photographers but also international, would they have had to have some connection with the Photographer's Gallery, or did she just send the invites out?
She sent the invites out, and there was a tremendous amount of goodwill, and there was a good international mix.
And so from then on, I guess, Sotheby's...
So that was... it put down a marker, I guess, that there was potential here, but it still took time for that potential to really grow. And I would say that through the 70s, 80s, the 19th century still dominated, with a growing increase in interest in the turn of the century and the avant-garde period between the wars. And that dominated the marketplace until relatively recently. And I would say that the big shift happened at the beginning of the 21st century, when those of us who'd been mining the 19th and earlier 20th centuries for so many years realized that the sources were drying up.
Yeah.
And it's an expression I use to explain the phenomenon, but they say nature abhors a vacuum, and absolutely so does the marketplace. You have to have product. And things can become too rare for their own good. And if you want to keep collectors interested, things have to be rare, but not impossibly rare. And clearly there was going to be a shift from 19th century and avant-garde to the post-war. And really that was happening around the time when I made some step changes in my professional life, meaning I left Sotheby's, joined Philips, it was then Philips de Pury Luxembourg, staging sales only in New York, and which I managed to do by commuting extraordinarily. And those Philips sales, and then the sales that we initiated at Christie's, I joined Christie's in 2004, really shift the focus. They shifted the focus to the post-war years. We did some very bold things, including quite a number of monographic sales, and I just found it very exciting and hugely satisfying to be able to make sales devoted to photographers who had caught my imagination already as a teenager.
So you'd have a sale with a single photographer?
Yes.
Or a single collection?
Yes.
Such as? I'm curious.
Such as Robert Mapplethorpe, Ansel Adams, Irving Penn, Richard Avedon, Cartier-Bresson, William Eggleston, quite a list.
One of the mysteries of the auction market is, why is fashion so much better regarded, fashion photography that is, than say documentary work?
That's a good question, and you're asking someone who's a great champion of fashion and related photography. I guess at one level, very simplistically, it tends to be easier to live with. It has a more decorative dimension, which is, I think, it's very immediately seductive. I'm always uncomfortable with the term fashion photography because it implies pictures of dresses. I mean, the photography that intrigues me under that umbrella is much wider ranging. I mean, it's a whole swathe of yes, fashion, but beauty and style and glamour and artifice. I think, in a sense, that's a key distinction between there's the documentary mode and there's the directorial mode, one might say. Pictures that are conceived and constructed, pictures that are taken more spontaneously. But it isn't. It's a grayscale.
Yeah, because it's interesting when we look back on those, the great early days of the Sunday Times, where you would have a Macmillan spread of 10 pages of award. These have almost virtually disappeared, haven't they? So, knowing your interest in magazines, what would you say about how these supplements have developed, or generally the magazine market, and how that actually has an effect on the auction market, even?
A multitude of questions and very interesting ones. Yes, there was a prime place for very troubling photographs, war reportage, famines, disasters could be front page news, and magazine cover and feature news at that time. In a way where it doesn't seem possible today. I know everybody has a camera, but the news is so filtered, sanitized, controlled, and access to the front line denied. We live in a very different world. But where to begin with the fascinating questions you're asking me? The place of magazines. I am the living proof of the impact of picture magazines, because in the 60s they were my source of nourishment. They were my source of education. I learnt so much through photographs that I found published in colour supplements and other magazines, that about such an array of things. I mean, architecture, the theatre, film, fashion, style, interior design. I mean, the whole range of subject matter, which was so central to me. The route to it was through the printed pages of magazines. I remember my avid appetite for the Sunday Times, Observer, Telegraph supplements, which were magazines like Town, Queen, later Nova, magazines which had elements of being style magazines, but also terrific reportage and high quality pictures of 1001 subjects. And already in the 60s, I mean, I was cutting out pictures from magazines, building a kind of imaginary museum, a reference archive of everything that intrigued me. And it was very subject-led, but gradually I came to realise that some of the photographs were better than others. There was a point of view. And I would check the credit lines of the photographers and realise that a Cecil Beaton or a William Klein or an Irving Penn had their way of looking at the world. So in a sense, subliminally, as I'm assimilating the subject matter, I'm also absorbing this notion that a great photographer brings a very individual perspective to looking at the world. I do think that you are so well known for your interest in photo books, in the illustrated book, which is, those books are the building blocks of the history of photography. But I think that the magazine page is every bit as important and every bit as worthy of our time and attention. In a sense, almost more so because they're more fragile and ephemeral.
Absolutely, and we collect magazines here, of course, at the Foundation. Interestingly, I'm a member of Magnum, and I don't think Magnum now could survive. Here we are, have the sort of classic, if you like, editorial agency, but with people that, in fact, have names beyond that. But one of the things that keeps us going is a square print sale, which is this twice yearly sale where we have small prints signed by the photographer or from the estate for $100. And this actually now has become a third of Magnum's income. So I think that's very interesting. And the other thing that's good about that potentially is that you're introducing a new generation of collectors who potentially can go up the food chain and start to buy not real prints, because these are real prints, but start to go up and explore further the marketplace which the current auction houses will be offering.
Interesting. I take great comfort from that. That there is a generation buying photographs at what one might call an entry level. And I would like to think that once you start, that there's something addictive about collecting photographs. I mean, the reality of the big auction houses is that we have, we've pursued the high end of the market. Which again can be counterproductive in drawing in new collectors, because people sometimes and often actually want to take small steps before feeling have the courage to take the big steps. What is the ideal form for a photograph is a question that I ask out of the conversation we're having. What is its authentic presence? A picture that was, you mentioned Don McCullin's war reportage in the Sunday Times. How should we feel about his pictures being on a gallery wall, as opposed to doing their job at the time, hitting the public between the eyes on the cover of a Sunday supplement.
And also, would someone want to hang that on their wall,
And
let
how,
alone
yes, how
in a
easy,
gallery?
Yes, I mean, there are photographs that have a place on a museum wall, in a museum collection, in a serious archive, but that would have, you'd have trouble. You'd encounter, I would say, ethical issues in commodifying them.
Well, this discussion, as you know, is never far away.
Yeah.
And finally, I just want to find out a bit more about your own taste. So, inevitably, you must have a collection of photographs. I don't really need to ask, but assuming you do, what direction has that gone in?
Well, a collection which I have been public about through many years was a collection that happened by chance, in a sense. I bought a photograph 50 years ago now. I bought a 19th century photograph of my hometown, which is Brighton. And then I bought another one, and then I bought another one. And then I thought, hey, this is interesting. Let me watch out for photographs of Brighton. Mm-hmm. And long story short, I built a collection around which I would describe as a history of photography, but very limited geographically. So it really tells the story of photography from the beginnings. An early gem is Fox Talbot negative of the Royal Pavilion, through to the time when I became a Londoner rather than Brighton-based, which was in the 70s. My interest in fashion and style has led me to collect in more recent years around a kind of a triangular axis of London, Paris, Rome, what I call a new wave in photography as it relates to the worlds of fashion, film, high society. Sort of La Dolce Vita to blow up and all that might embrace. And that has kept me very busy.
Very good.
And I think there are projects to be drawn from that. Some years ago at the Photographer's Gallery, well, it was on the anniversary of the making of Blow Up, the materials that I'd collected around the film Blow Up were the subject of an exhibition. So
that was a very smart
more to be
acquisition.
Done. Yeah,
that's very good. Thank you, Philip. This has been very, very interesting, absolutely fascinating. Thank you for coming.
A pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.